Hello, I'm Ray Jones. I'm recently a Professor of Social Work at Kingston University, St George's University of London, and welcome to this, the first of 4 Knowledge and Evidence events organised by the Association of Professors of Social Work. Julian Wish from the University of Sussex is hosting the events and is controlling the Zoom screens. It would be very helpful if everyone else could mute themselves and turn off their videos. Otherwise, we're going to have a rather crowded session. Each of the keys, the Knowledge and Evidence events, is being recorded and will be available on the APSW website, the Association of Professors of Social Work website, along with the PowerPoint presentations from today and from the future 3 keys as well. The Knowledge and Evidence events are an opportunity to remind ourselves and to share key messages about the knowledge that we have regarding children's social services, how best to organise those services, and how best to practice. And this is timely with the DfE review of children's social care underway. Each key, each Knowledge and Evidence event will have presentations, and they'll be from people who have been at the forefront of developing and promoting services and social work to assist children and families. All have backgrounds as practitioners, and all have been leading researchers, teachers, managers, and leaders within the profession, working with children and families, both in the UK and internationally. Throughout the key, there's the opportunity to contribute by making comments through the chat function. So please do get chatting, and later in the session, Louise Brown, who's Professor of Social Work at the University of Bath, will be feeding back on major themes that come up from the chat. So please do make your contribution through the chat session. There's also the opportunity to tweet. Colleagues at Research and Practice will be tweeting during the session, and the hashtag is on the screen beside me at the moment. This first key, the first of 4, is focused on how we organise services to assist children and families. And the 3 presenters have each undertaken major studies and reviews to help inform us. The first is Marion Brandon, Emeritus Professor of Social Work at the University of East Anglia, who has led on major overview reports on serious case reviews. Marion, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Brilliant, I've got a slide there. I feel very humbled to be kicking off this series of events. But first of all, I want to acknowledge that there are a number of well-rehearsed problems with using serious case reviews as evidence for change, not least that the learning can take so long to percolate through that it can be felt to have lost its relevance. Other criticisms revolve around the problems of learning from when things go wrong rather than from what works, and the blame and misunderstanding that this can engender. But these reviews and the newer reviews that have replaced them are powerful testimonies to children's harm and to their lost lives. And we have a legal and a moral obligation to learn from them. So I'm going to be talking about some learning from our studies of reviews dating back to children's cases from 2003. Where I can, I've checked our learning against reports on the new system of reviews that have been published in the last week to be sure that the points are still relevant now. I'll spend the next few minutes talking about 4 broad areas from our serious case review analyses. Firstly, about complexity and challenge. Secondly, I'll be asking how successful overall the current child protection system is. Thirdly, where did we find weak spots in the system? And finally, how do trusting relationships fit in organisational structure and design? And how do trusting relationships affect working together dynamics? If there's time, I'll end by summarising 4 key messages, but Ray may well cut me off by then. Gillian, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. The complexity of each child and family's circumstances has been a powerful theme running through each of our biennial and triennial analyses. This poses profound challenges for practitioners, particularly in the context of a decade of austerity and cuts to services, which have affected both workers and families. This complexity and challenge prompted the title of our latest triennial analysis. However, the detail and extent of this complexity is only known to the review in hindsight. So for practitioners, the risks of harm to the child at the time may be much less clear. To add to the complexity, children and families at the centre of most reviews will appear at first glance very much like the families and children that practitioners encounter every day. But the risks of harm in each case play out very differently. So this lack of certainty and the constant professional concern about whether the child is safe enough is at the heart of child protection and wider safeguarding practice. Next slide, please, Gillian. Thank you. So how successful overall is the child protection system? The number of children who die through abuse or neglect is a very crude measure of the success of the child protection system. Our analyses show that the annual number of deaths which are directly related to abuse, and those are the dark blue bottom sections of each of those bars, has remained at a relatively stable level in spite of austerity cuts and increasing levels of poverty during the last decade. Also, only a small minority of children at the centre of a review had a child protection plan in place. Most recently, this was 15%. So the pattern of reviews shows that once a child is known to be in need of protection, the system is working well, and the very substantial majority of children are protected from the most serious harm. Any changes to the system need to bear this in mind. Could I have the next slide now, Gillian? Thank you. Moving on to weak spots. Looking at where children at the centre of review are found in the system shows us where the fault lines are. Around half of the reviews took place for children whose families were below the threshold for children's social care. Yet many children had been previously known, at least to the level of in need. This amounted to around 2/3 of our reviews over time, and 60% of reviews from last week's report from the national panel. So how to safeguard children with known vulnerabilities is very much a current issue. Thresholds into and out of services are pressure points in the system. Over the years, many serious case reviews have clustered just below the threshold for services from children's social care, or at the borders of child in need and child protection. If these cases don't reach the threshold for a service, the children's needs, including their need for protection, can easily be missed, or the child can disappear from view, for example, where there's homeschooling. Similarly, a decision to end children's social care involvement when a child protection plan ends is particularly unsafe when there is no clear alternative plan for support or monitoring, or a lack of clarity over who's going to follow plans through. Children with known vulnerabilities may need long-term flexible support. This needs attention at a strategic and multidisciplinary level. In terms of any redesign of organisational shape and structure, this means that the boundaries between services need to be shored up and not separated and fragmented. Boundaries need to be fluid and responsive so children can be helped along a continuum of need and harm as intended in the Children Act 1989. So, where do trusting relationships fit in organisational structure and design? Safety for children and protection from abuse are ultimately produced by good, warm, trusting relationships that offer care and nurture. These are the conditions that provide solid foundations for good child development. Practitioners have an important role in helping children and their parents to establish better relationships. And improvements are encouraged when a good relationship is forged between workers and the family. However, when needy, suspicious, frightened, or desperate families coping with poverty and other adversities are faced by overwhelmed practitioners, building a strong relationship is a challenge. We know that parents and children may be reluctant to open up to professionals if they're constantly changing, or if they have had negative experiences with previous services or previous workers, and especially if parents fear their children will be removed if problems are admitted. The already stressful day-to-day demands of frontline practice are intensified by repeated organisational change, by staff turnover, absence, and staff sickness. In these circumstances, we found that professionals sometimes kept a distance from children and their problems, taking on a restricted, minimal professional role. At other times, practitioner fearfulness or anxiety could foster reluctance to support or challenge parents, or to reach out to truculent or reticent teenagers. The ways in which children are at risk of harm is complex and requires clear thinking from practitioners. The emotional and intellectual demands on workers are substantial. We know that practitioners who are overwhelmed not only with the volume of work, but also by the nature of the work, struggle to think, understand, make good decisions, and to do even the simple things well. So, how do these tensions play out in working together dynamics? Each of our analyses has highlighted the importance of sustained and dogged professional challenge and the ability to question with confidence and authority colleagues in your own agency and in partner agencies. Continue the early discussion about thresholds. Where a practitioner continues to have concerns about a child and feels that their concerns haven't been understood or acted on, they have a professional duty to escalate those concerns through their agency or partnership channels. But this doesn't always happen. In our latest triennial study, one partnership tackled escalation reluctance by renaming the process resolving professional differences. And they coupled this linguistic change with buy-in across all partner agencies and a launch of the new process. They saw tangible improvements from this more practitioner-friendly language and approach. When we carried out interviews with practitioners at the time of the media storm surrounding Peter Connolly's death, we found that challenging other professionals, especially when they're more senior or of a perceived higher status, was more likely when practitioners had strong professional confidence. This confidence came from strong leadership, enabling good support and trust within teams, and from good reflective and challenging supervision. In turn, this seemed to prompt clear lines of communication with other agencies. Confident, well-supported workers who communicated well with colleagues from other agencies were also better placed to create good working relationships with children and families. In these circumstances, it appeared easier not only to see children, but also to keep them in mind and understand them. Strong leadership helps to avoid the blame that can easily come with these worst cases. When I asked one director of children's services in a successful local authority what the secret of their success was, the reply came, "We don't make a big fuss when things go wrong, because sometimes they will go wrong." Which leads me back to my 4 key messages. So can I have the last slide, please, Gillian? Thank you. So where children die or are seriously harmed through abuse, there is a high level of complexity and individual differences between each case that at first glance may look the same. Children cannot always be protected. The boundaries between services and levels of need and harm should be fluid and responsive as intended by the Children Act 1989. Children and families with known vulnerabilities may move back and forth along the continuum of need and harm and may need services long term. Trusting relationships with families are the best route to seeing when things are going badly wrong. And finally, trusting professional relationships within and across agencies make it easier to protect children, to support families, and to share information safely. Thank you very much indeed.
Marion, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure some of those messages are likely to be repeated through the session and through the remaining knowledge and evidence events as well. Thank you. Turning now to Eileen. Eileen Munro is Emeritus Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics and will be well known from her major review of child protection. And it's the 10th anniversary of that review. So Eileen, over to you.
Oh, I've got my video on at last. Yes, thank you. I got asked by the incoming coalition government in 2010 to do a review of the child protection system. And I knew that I was in a long line of people doing reviews, a line that is continuing on now with Josh McAllister. And I also knew that my predecessors had been intelligent and they had done good reviews and they'd come up with recommendations that had looked very sensible and reasonable. And yet we weren't seeing the kind of progress that we were wanting to see. In fact, I would say that over my working career, my impression is that practice improved steadily through the 1980s and the mid-1990s, and then it started to lose track. And by the time I did my review in 2010, it was a very unhappy system. The workforce were unhappy, and the families receiving services weren't too happy either. So next slide, please. Thank you. I took a different approach from my predecessors by doing a systems analysis. And that means not looking at the structure, but looking at the causal links, the interactions and the feedback loops in the system. Because changing the structure while the dynamics of the system stay the same means that you don't change practice. And when people act in ways that with hindsight look wrong, just saying they should stop doing that and adding a procedure telling them to stop doing that doesn't help. It's much better to say, why did they do it? On the assumption that on the whole, the workforce have joined child protection social work because they want to improve children's lives. So it should puzzle us when they do things that aren't in the child's best interest. And most people go into social work with a wish to work respectfully with families rather than to investigate them as if they were in a test tube being poked around by investigators. So to me, what had happened in the system was puzzling. And The diagram you see that you can't read clearly is what's called a causal loop diagram. And I worked with an analyst of trying to capture the major forces at play. On the right-hand side, you have the Department for Education and its adoption of new public management, which led to the introduction of performance indicators and targets. You get Ofsted copying that and looking at compliance with those issues. You've got serious case reviews tending to come up with more recommendations to go in the procedure manual. And on the left-hand side, you have the families and the social work profession. So next slide, please. The next, yes, thank you. So unfortunately, the photos on my screen, can I move them because they're blocking part of the slide for me? I wonder if I can, oh yeah, I can shift them down, that's it. Now I can read the whole slide, that helps. So I've picked out some of the key findings. One is where the system had a focus on slowly shifted from children's safety and well-being to processes, leading to compliance with procedures, squeezing out the time for forming respectful and helpful relationships with children and their families. A single example, I think, illustrates it, what happened slowly over time. A committee many years ago was discussing the way that referral to a child protection agency was a stressful event for a family. And they concluded that it would be reasonable for families to get an initial decision back on what was likely to happen within about a week. And when you follow that piece of advice down through the years, by the time I did my review, you had the task that you had to complete the initial assessment form and have it signed off by your supervisor within 7 days. And it had turned from being a professional concern to alleviate anxiety in the family into being a bureaucratic concern done in order to please the Department for Education and Ofsted. The fact that the heavy proceduralization was damaging the relationship between workers and families, people in the families and the workforce, the frontline workers, were trying to talk about that dysfunction, but their voices were outweighed by the people on the right-hand side of my diagram, which was the DFE, the Ofsted and serious case reviews. I also found that the unavoidable uncertainty in child protection was being hidden by a culture that treated compliance with procedures as safe practice. It provides the due diligence defense if anything goes wrong, but that means it's safe for practitioners and managers rather than safe for children. And the workforce's anxiety about making fallible judgments led to over-referral from other agencies, the partner agencies, and over-investigation, because people were really worried about missing that very rare case of extreme violence. And Marion has brought out how rare that is out of the numbers that come our way. And I know one of the changes that Josh McAllister, among many others, is considering is whether there is a benefit in separating child protection from family support systems. And that kind of separation exists in most of the American states and the Australian states. And they have a different structure, but they have in fact evolved the same dynamics as the English system over time. So they have been very interested in my report, and a lot of them have taken it to heart and tried to make changes in the light of it. So having the different structure didn't stop them from following the same path as the English system. Next slide, please. So what I recommended, I think it's probably because my research interest is so much in decision-making and judgment-making, then I put the first bullet point as we really have to start talking about the judgments are fallible. We cannot, however well we work, predict the future with great accuracy. And human behavior is extremely unpredictable, especially violence can just spiral out of no apparent evidence of predecessors. It's not as if people get slowly more and more violent. That's one presentation, but it's frequently just a particular concatenation of events. And then the change in the inspection framework, the change in working together, you will probably be aware of. And I also recommended a whole system reform for each agency, children's social care, to embed a clear practice framework which had professional values and a clear statement of professional skills and knowledge, so that and shifting the organizational focus to how well you are engaging with families and improving life for children. So next slide, please. So what has happened since then has been a major reduction in rules. I'm very happy that politicians set the goals, but I think professionals should set the rules about how to achieve those goals. The Ofsted inspection process now has a much stronger emphasis upon the impact that they're having on children and families, and that is slowly having a cumulative impact upon local authorities of learning of what they need to do in order to get a good rating. On the negative side, there have been 40% funding cuts and increased referrals to children's social care. Families are suffering from greater social inequality, and there's a reduction in other services, and families also face higher insecurity about housing and jobs. Despite all those hardships, some children's social care departments have made the kind of whole system change I was recommending. And they've done so to an extent that Ofsted has judged them to be outstanding. And I've had contact with a lot of those, and they're doing the kind of practice which you can be proud of. It's the kind of practice that most of us came into social work to do. It is about using authority, but still engaging respectfully and therapeutically with people. The reality is that of the hundreds of thousands of children referred to social care each year, only a tiny percentage are ever removed from their family. So that at the start of your contact with a family, you should be strongly aware that you're either going to close the case or you're going to wish to work collaboratively with that family. And therefore that has to be shaping your very initial starting point. You can't just start in one mood of being a rather unkind investigator and then smile and say, now I'm shifting into being Mr. Nice in so far. So I think there is hope in those authorities that have made such good progress, but far too few have done so. I mean, there are huge problems in the success sector in terms of funding and referral rates. And some of them are starting on that journey, and it takes a long time. Even the ones that have made good progress would still say they had a long way to go to see the quality that they're aspiring to. So my final point there is I think that the current review, I hope, will explore how some people are doing it so well and what we can learn from them and how we can spread their confidence and their expertise. Thank you.
Eileen, thank you. That was absolutely marvellous. Some really powerful messages again. And just a quick reminder, if you have chat comments to make, now's the time to make them, because after the next presentation, and Louise will be feeding back on what people have been contributing through the chat comments. So get those comments coming through. I see there's quite a few already. There was one asking about the PowerPoints and the presentations and where they'll be available. They'll be available on the Association of Professors of Social Work site, and I know the link to that's gone up as well. And we're also recording the session so that the actual video that's being recorded will be available on the APSW site as well. Our third presentation is from Nikki Stanley. Nikki is a professor of social work at the University of Central Lancashire, and way back in the mid-2000s now, New Labour introduced some pilots called social work practices, which Nikki is about to talk about, and Nikki undertook the major research about those social work practices. Nikki, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Thank you to APSW for organising this event. It's great to have so many people attending. So the tale I'm going to tell you is a cautionary tale, and it should be considered alongside other cautionary tales, such as, for example, the outsourcing of the probation service, which is now being moved, at least in part, back into the public sector. Outsourcing is often seen as the answer to some of the problems Eileen has been describing. I'm going to present some evidence as to how outsourcing actually performed under scrutiny. Could we have the next slide, please? So in 2009 to 10, social work practices for looked after children and care leavers were established as pilots. They were the brainchild of Julian Legrand, whose work was highly influential in introducing market forces into public services, particularly health services. And he turned his attention to children's social care and advocated for social work practices, which were going to be small social worker-led organizations operating outside local authorities. They were going to look somewhat like GP practices, and they were going to improve the quality of staff's relationships with children and families. They were going to improve continuity, make for faster decision-making, and boost staff morale, and so boost retention in the profession. So they were going to do a lot of things. In order to set up these pilots, legislation was required to allow local authorities to transfer statutory responsibilities for children in out-of-home care to independent social work-led organisations. And that was done through the Children and Young Persons Act 2008. So local authorities took responsibility for putting out tenders for social work practices. There were real difficulties in recruiting social work practices, and in the event, only 5 of the 9 social work practices planned in the first wave were actually commissioned. This was despite the DFE putting in quite a lot of consultancy support for the commissioning process. And 1,100 children and young people were moved into 5 social work practice pilots, which all looked rather different from each other in the event. 2 were described as professional practice models. One was privately owned, one was a social enterprise. 2 were managed by voluntary organisations. One was a newly created organisation. One was an established voluntary organisation that had already been involved in providing services to care leavers. And one social work practice actually never left the local authority and was described as the in-house model. So I led a team of researchers that undertook the evaluation between 2009 and 12. And researchers from the University of Central Lancashire did that, alongside researchers from the, let's see if I can get the names right these days, the Social Workforce Research Unit at King's College London and the Social Science Research Unit at the Institute of Education. It was a large and well-funded study. It used a match control design with integral process evaluation, and 5 social work pilots were matched with comparison local authorities. We collected a lot of data. We did 225 interviews with looked after children and young people. Some of those were interviewed twice. We interviewed parents, staff, commissioners, IROs, other professionals. We did 2 large surveys with staff and foster carers, and we analysed care plans, 903 data specifically on placement change and workforce data. I'm telling you the end of the story at the beginning, which is cheating a little bit, but the pilots' contracts ended in 2014, and at that point, 3 of them did not have their contracts renewed, and the in-house social work practice was absorbed back into the local authority. Only 1 of the 5 pilots remained operational in 2014, and my understanding is that that closed in 2018. Could we have the next slide, please? So we used in our evaluation some key measures to look at the experiences of children and young people in social work practices and how that compared to the experiences of children and young people who were being cared for by local authorities. So this was, if you like, treatment as usual. Quality of the relationships had been an important argument for setting up social work practices. This is what social work practices were going to transform. We found that the vast majority of children and young people in both the social work practices and the comparison sites reported that their allocated social workers listened to them, they cared about them, and did their best. I recall Julian Legrand saying at the inception of social work practices that social work practices social workers were really going to be those social workers who went the extra mile for children and young people. what we found was that actually there were social workers in the social work practices, but also in local authority social work teams who went the extra mile. And you can see here 2 care leavers, both describing their social workers who went the extra mile for them. Accessibility was going to be an important feature of social work practice staff. We found no differences between social work practices and comparison sites. We found differences between the social work practices. In one practice, staff were described as really accessible by children and parents, and in another they were described by children, parents, and indeed other professionals as really inaccessible. There were also differences between workers, with less qualified workers actually being seen to be more available to children and families. In terms of continuity, children in social work practices were more likely to report worker continuity in the last year, but staff turnover was actually high in 2 of the social work practices. And continuity was undermined by the changes of key workers that children experienced on their transfer in and then out of social work practices when they returned to local authority care. And some of those transfers took place without children and young people and their parents actually being involved in the decision-making to any meaningful extent. And here's a quote from a 14-year-old who was really very angry. They knew their social worker nearly all their life, and then they just go and change it. Most social work practices were successful in reducing placement changes in the first year of operation, but not in the social work practice that used incentives to cut placement costs and made heavy use of private sector placements. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, in terms of organisational measures, the social work practices remained highly dependent on their host local authorities, both for startup, but also in the longer term. The most successful social work practice had a really high level of support from the local authority. The least successful had a low level of support from the host local authority. They were reliant on local authorities for supervision and training, legal services, insurance, IT, out-of-hours services, premises, equipment, job security, and advice on complex cases and child protection work. There was no evidence that social work practices reduced costs, and some of the senior managers in local authorities interviewed felt they could have done it cheaper themselves. This is quite an important finding because outsourcing is often seen as the answer to too much bureaucracy, but actually there were no differences between social work practice staff and comparison site staff in terms of the time spent on form filling. It was just the same. Staff morale was higher on some measures in social work practices, but it was counteracted by higher job insecurity. And that job insecurity fed into staff turnover. So you won't find this enormously surprising, particularly if you're a practitioner, but staff satisfaction was linked to opportunities for direct work with children and young people, good supervision and workplace support, and smaller caseloads. And in the social work practices, caseloads were all under 18 children for the practitioners. Okay, if we could have the final slide. So our conclusion was that the social work practice pilots never really achieved full independence from the local authorities. And what we saw in this experiment was the interdependency of the public and independent sectors. Smaller caseloads, good quality supervision, direct work with children and families, you know, that's what we all want. And they obviously increase staff satisfaction. These features come about when you have a good level of resource. They are not specific to contracting out. We found no differences between the social work practices and the local authority controls in the quality of relationships social workers had with children and young people and in their accessibility to children and families. So our conclusion was that outsourcing doesn't make for continuity of relationships or organisation. The independent sector is a great place for imagination and innovation, and a lot of new ideas come from there. But social work practices prove fragile and unsustainable. If you want stability and predictability of funding, that is to be found in local authorities, and they are better placed to offer continuity. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you. I'm watching the time, and I think there will be time for each of the presenters to come back towards the end of our time together with, if you like, one key message that they might want to give. And we've had several key messages already, but there might be some other thoughts coming through. So there will be an opportunity for each of the presenters to come back with one key thought that they might want to make sure that we really hear and hammer home. And I suppose the person that's had the most difficult task while we've been listening to the presentations is Louise. Louise Brown is Professor of Social Work at the University of Bath, and she's been monitoring the chat responses and contributions. I've been seeing them on screen as well. Thank you for those who've been contributing in terms of chatting away, and some really strong things coming through. But Louise, what have you been spotting?
Wow. You're right, that was a very difficult task. We were worried that there would be no comments, and I invited comments and we were almost overloaded. So please bear with me, and apologies if I've not picked up individual points that people made. Wow, so I'm going to try and provide some sort of a summary in the 30 seconds that I've had to look at all of those. I think what was interesting, maybe I can reflect on what I saw, because it's difficult to summarize so much. I think first of all that there's a lot of people out there who are very interested in this topic and would like an opportunity to discuss it more. I think we'd have to conclude that first and foremost. The first presentation raised quite a lot of comments. There was a real thread running through about the difficulty in the relationship between child protection and child in need CHIN cases, and as one person put it, when to step down and the timing of that, and how difficult it is to manage that, so that if we have families exiting the formal child protection system too quickly, then they're dropping out of family support often too quickly as well. And then that's when things go wrong further down the line. So I think it was fair to say that the comments certainly resonate with the key points that Marion was making at the beginning, and a real concern around that relationship between child protection and CHIN. I'm going to just try and summarize, I think, what I saw after that. And there were quite a lot of comments in relation to the discussion about the importance of meaningful long-term relationships, and how to do that and how to maintain those, and relationships not just being important with families, but with a full range of professionals as well. But a really nice question that summed it up about how can we make those meaningful long-term relationships against a backdrop of a whole series of concerns that people flagged up. And I'll just run through some of the ones that I was able to jot down. Perhaps as we might expect, and we heard through some of the presentations, a concern about the procedural preoccupation that can occur, the difficulty that social workers teams are having with the form filling, the need for time and space to build those relationships, and the difficulty in doing that in a system that is driven by time and time restraints. There were a whole range of comments about workload retention, the impact of high workloads, the impact on the stability of the workforce, retention and burnout, and the interesting comments about, you know, are there ways in which the data that's collected from teams can be used to help teams and the profession learn, not just highlighting failures in systems. And I think one of the comments that summed up the sort of sense I was getting from all of the feedback really was that these are worrying times. I think that's what people were saying, that these were worrying times. But I want to draw attention to also the other side to the comments, which was really lovely to see about the positivity in many responses. So quite often when somebody put up something that was a worrying comment or something that was very difficult about the profession, others responded with suggestions and potential ways forward. And I just want to flag up some of those around relationships with other services, the need for learning culture, understanding the impact of poverty. And that very much came up as, well, isn't this the elephant in the room, austerity and the impact of poverty on families? But people suggesting the use of a whole systems approach, working in a relational way, restorative practice, FGCs, repairing and building relationships. So coming back again to the issue about relationships, wanting to find ways to ensure that the value base of social work is leading practice, the importance of good local authority, political and professional leadership, and having and working in good, solid teams as a foundation for strong practice. So it was encouraging to see that list of potential suggestions and solutions being offered at all in response to that. So I think I'm going to stop there. I thought that two of the interesting questions that came out were around how we can make meaningful long-term relationships and whether the panel want to respond to that at all, and also how we can improve and develop child protection services when public services are so underfunded. I think that was a sort of flavour, if you like, of many of the comments that came through. So I don't know whether people would like to come back and comment on that, about how can we improve and develop the services with public services being so underfunded at the moment. And is there anything more that we could add this afternoon about making those meaningful long-term relationships?
Louise, that's really impressive for two reasons. And one is both the content and the quality and the number of the chat contributions. Thank you to everyone. And secondly, Louise, I think you'd have a great career if you ever were to cover election night on the BBC or ITN or whatever, to pick up so many disparate, if you like, messages on the move, and the feedback so coherently. It was absolutely marvellous. Thank you very much for doing that. And the colleagues who have made the presentations, just reflecting on some of those chat comments and those things picked up by Louise, but you also may have messages that you want to give yourselves. Coming back in, Marion, first of all, anything that you would want to pick up in particular?
Sorry, there's someone else.
Sorry, if you put your video or microphone on, it'd be great if you could turn it off. But Marion, any big messages from you?
Yes, I mean, I was interested in all the comments about the positivity and how to, how to make and keep good relationships. And I think kind of one of the key things is to find organisations that value the workforce and help you to do that. It's a tough job. It's really tricky. It gets to you. So you need to have very good support and kindness from colleagues and all the way through the system, including from local politicians. So actually, being kind to the work, valuing the workforce, I think is incredibly important. And for people to find themselves jobs in organisations where they do feel valued. And I think that helps you go the extra mile and stick with families and children and create the long-term relationships. But it's not easy at all in this current climate, but people are doing it. So, congratulations to them.
And Eileen, do come back in with your microphone on and video as well and join in the conversation. But Nikki, thoughts from you?
Well, I think Louise raised the issue of engagement over time. with children and families, which I think is really important and has come up in a lot of my work on domestic violence and abuse. And I know in other reports on children's social care, a lot of families really need that continuity and consistency of relationship over time. And one of the problems in the past has been the pressure to open and close cases, so that families are continually revolving through children's social care. And I think that a level of resource that allows families to retain a relationship with practitioners, even when the need is less acute, and to go on enjoying that supportive relationship is enormously important and valuable for many families. Not all need that. I mean, some are very pleased to end their involvement with children's social care. But for some families, the opportunity for longer term engagement, I think is really important.
Eileen?
Well, I think the issue of funding is very fundamental, that money is both a big factor in making family life stressful, but also of being able to provide the quality of service we want. And I question whether people have got their priorities right in terms of, if you haven't got enough money to do everything, I don't think you should stop spending time with families, but you should stop spending so much time recording. I don't think there's a great deal of merit in having a perfect record of poor quality practice. I would prefer to see good quality practice with sketchy recording. And I think the fact that some authorities are managing to shake off that culture of not looking at the world through a procedural mask, but of actually looking at children and families directly, does give us hope that that we've got examples of how to make progress on this. But I keep harping on about the fallibility of our judgments, and we should stop talking about people getting things right or wrong, but either having a well-reasoned decision or a poorly reasoned decision. And it's not the outcome of what happens later that you judge the reasoning by, but by what process they went through. And I think I have a great worry that the interest in cutting down on office space, which might have even been exacerbated by home working during the pandemic, may lead people to underestimate the importance of the team for the ongoing intellectual and the emotional work that social workers do. They're not just your mates. That chat over a coffee break is actually of huge professional value to you. So
Eileen, you've been in several local authorities over recent months and recent years. And when you're seeing an authority, a service you think is doing better, what is it that characterises that authority compared to some of the others that you've seen?
The senior managers talk about children. I can remember when I did my review, a number of directors were telling me proudly about their performance data. And when I go to an authority now, they are talking about good practice. They're talking about examples they've seen of really great engagement with a child. They're focused, their workforce feel they're focused on the right things.
Yeah. And Nikki, Marion, any last comments from you before we move towards summing up?
I think they realise what an important job they're doing and how valuable it is, and keep on doing it. We would be really stuck without social workers, and children would really suffer and families would suffer. So keep doing the good work.
Nikki?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to remember is that social work is about relationships. And it's the quality of those relationships between practitioners and children and families that really counts. It's a people business. So the question is how you nurture and support those relationships, relationships, and the trust that needs to inform those relationships is built over time, not in a week or 2 weeks assessment. Good quality social work needs time, and it needs supervision and support and colleagues, and it needs money, it needs resources. And at the moment, many authorities are being asked to deliver services in an economic climate that's simply not conducive to good quality social work. And, you know, we have to stop arguing for this or that model and argue strongly for the resources that services need to function at a high level.
Okay, thanks for that. And Annabelle, I see you were asking about the chat thread. We'll make sure that's available, as I understand it, on the Association of Professors of Social Work website as well. Moving towards a conclusion, being very aware of time, can we have the next slide, Gillian? And this was a stab from me in terms of what I thought I might be saying in summing up. And I'm pleased to say I've got at least some of it right. I knew what the presenters were going to say. And we've had three very powerful, well-informed presentations by people who are very experienced and considerable expertise in children's social work and social care this afternoon. But we've also had major contributions in terms of the chat contributions, the chat comments, which reinforce some of the big messages that hopefully have been launched today and will be recorded for the future. The first one is about continuity and stability. It's about having services where there's not too much churn and change, where there's a stable workforce that is able to build confidence as well as increasing competence, where relationships with families and children are continuous. They're not fragmented by handovers between teams and workers or workers coming and going. And they're not fragmented by handovers between agencies and between different services, that there's some continuity. Someone who's anchoring that experience of being beside a child and family at a time of difficulty and stress. And that might be something which needs, as we've been mentioned this afternoon, longer term rather than short term. I do remember and reflect back on what we used to call community social work. Social workers embedded in communities, working alongside children and families over a period of time, being aware of the networks within those communities as well, where those communities were a resource for families, harnessing those resources, where those communities were a threat for families, being aware of that, but also stability and continuity in other agencies, with other professionals, with other workers in schools, health services, policing, for example, under 5 services. So there was trust between professionals and they communicated and knew each other well enough to be able to work together. So one of the things it seems to me that we have to prioritise is building continuity and stability. And I fear that some of that we may have lost over recent years. And the corollary is be very wary of fragmenting and of fragmentation. Nikki was talking about what happened in the probation service. 2/3 of the probation service were outsourced and privatised. 1/3 was left within a national probation service, which was supposed to be focusing on high-risk offenders. But people move up and down continuums. Children in need, child protection, same families, same children at different times. So be wary of fragmentation in terms of how we organise services. And Eileen's really powerful comments about working with uncertainty. And I saw some of the chat comments about how organisations either help or don't help that. What we need are organisations where, as has been commented, senior managers stay close to their front line. Senior managers understand the nature of the work that's being undertaken. Senior managers are experienced themselves in that work. And frontline workers and those close to the front line in terms of practice, team managers and frontline practitioners, have the space and the opportunity to feed back up through the organisations, as well as just being the recipient of messages sent down through organisations. I know from what Eileen has been talking about that those organisations that are performing well have that type of culture. More of those organisations need to be created, but they need to be created in a time of stability and continuity. Relationships and resources, the comments that came through in the chat functions about building relationship takes time. Having the time to be beside families, having the time to actually get to know workers and other agencies is a resource that sometimes is very scarce. And having that confidence to be beside children and families at times of crisis and chaos, trauma and turmoil, painful times, requires organisations through supervision, through teamwork, actually support us all in doing that difficult work. And that when necessary, the resources are available to call upon to help those families as well. Children's centres, family centres, whatever happened to Sure Start, youth services, etc., parenting programmes, and tackling poverty that are impinging on families and making it much more difficult to care well for children. And several times today we've heard about capacity, cash and time. Capacity to do the job well, cash to actually fund those services well, and time actually requires cash because we need enough workers with enough space to be able to do the job that needs to be done. So I think those are some of the big messages and reflections coming out from today, and which I've no doubt at all will be reflected upon also in the knowledge and evidence events which are ahead of us. Today's session will be on the APSW website. The chat comments, I think, will be on the APSW website, and there will also be a briefing note prepared on each of the knowledge and evidence events in partnership with Research and Practice, and that also will be on the APSW website. The next knowledge and evidence event is on equality, diversity and inclusion. If you've not registered already, do register. You can register through the APSW site. 600-700 people are already registered for that event. The maximum number for each of the events is 1,000. More than 1,000 people tried to register for today. So hopefully most of the 1,000 people who did manage to get to register were able to get to us today as well. But do stay with us for the next 3 events. And many thanks for joining us today.